As an archon and scholar, I study all manner of topics, from the migration pattern of the common gubu to the fundamental metaphysics of aether conductivity. But for some reason, the question I'm asked most often is, can the different races reproduce with each other? The answer is yes, technically. Why do you ask? Setting aside motivations, first let's talk about the proof of concept. There are more than a few people throughout the land who have mixed parentage, both explicitly and potentially. From the most prominent examples, we have Ishgard's Hilda, whose father is Eorzean nobility, and whose mother was a Hyrrian maid in her father's house. And two more being our Garlean Hyr allies, the scions Arenvald, whose mother was an Alamegan Highlander and father an occupying Garlean soldier, and Severa, whose mother was a Hyr of Turncliffe and whose father was an occupying Garlean soldier. The conflict of the past century has sadly led to more than a few children born to such Garlean heritage, most often not by choice and for whom life has been a complicated affair. There's also less dour progeny born from love, like the eloping Hyr and Eorzean couple of Ishgard who found their way to Idleshire and who share a child. These examples are beyond doubt and put proof to word that such things do happen. And yet, there are large sums of peoples around the star who may fall into this camp, but we just don't know for certain. Tales in the Ruby Sea exist of an Auri child, born to a Hyrrian fisherman and an Auri Rain, who was in fact the Ruby Princess of that time. Those of Sui no Sato claim the tales to be true, and nearby legends of a fisherman who traveled to see the rain and disappeared beneath the sea do offer some corroboration, but with no documentation of the event, it's impossible to be sure. We can even bring into question certain clans, like the branch of Athardian Rogadin, some of who are visually identical to their far-reach brethren, while others have a distinctly more Hyrrian complexion. I want to caution that this is speculation, because as far as we know, they are merely a normal derivation of the Hellsguard clan. There are even some Rogadin around the world who suspiciously appear Hyrrian in complexion and size, and on occasion don't necessarily even boast a traditional Rogadin name. But I choose to not be the Archon who walks up to one and asks of their mother's heritage. So this will remain a mystery. There are other areas of more uncertain intermingling of names and people throughout history, like the Hyr and Eorzean of Gelmora, the Hrothgar, Rogadin, and Hyr of Baja, the Auri and Hyr of Thavnair, and of course the Rogadin and Highlanders of Alamigo, to name a few. We even have extreme mixing pots like my native Sharlayan. These places, though intermittent, have resulted in some uncertainty as to what interactions and children have been brought to be throughout history, though a dearth of such children exist in the historical records and tales. So, with procreating between groups, when it comes to Hyr, in some cases it's fairly easy to say beyond a shadow of a doubt, yes, it's possible. In other cases, maybe? Whether the other races are capable of procreating with Hyr or with each other is by all known physiology possible, if not likely, but a lack of examples makes it hard to test and know for sure, and that is one trial I have no wish to run. One would think that rare or not, the possible tales of Rogadin with furry ears or a long and lanky Hrothgar would be at the very least common around the drinking table, if not in scientific journals. But capability says nothing of actuality, and there are two major hurdles to conception of a biracial child on Etheris. The first is societal. There is a major taboo against mixed-race procreation, though these taboos aren't particularly codified, and ultimately most present themselves as general discrimination for those who do not end up fitting the world's neat criteria. This common disdain can lead to difficulties integrating into groups for individuals, which can be a death sentence in many regions of the star, and the complications that await the parents often result in doomed lovers nipping their romance in the bud ere long. With all of that said, that does not affect people's perspectives, or at least create codified restrictions around passions between different races. In probably the broadest possible way, do we see this through the regularity of sex work by Mikote and Hyr, all the way from Thanalin to Lenosia to Alamigo and beyond. These two realities can be tough to reconcile, since a child begets so much scorn, and yet lovemaking and romance is so normalized. For all the act of creation between two different races may invite derision, love will not be denied, and can often push past any barrier, failing to keep star-crossed lovers from still attempting to fill their hearths and homes with the pitter-patter of small feet. Some of these taboos are probably rooted in the long swaths of history where many nations, especially in Eorzea, were a monoculture, with somewhat infrequent examples of multiracial groups that weren't at least somewhat discordant. Not that things have particularly changed today in some ways. Those few we do see, like Gelmora, Thavnair, Baja, or Doma, were all notably brought about from major initial conflict and strife between peoples, ultimately finding their equilibrium, but only as a function of time, and it's a process that continues to this day. For all the social progressivism we've seen in the 7th Astral Era, we need not look further back than a couple of decades to see active regression or narrow-minded beliefs, and even onto modern times many hold such views. Think of the treatment of Hilda by many of her fellowish guardians for a reality she had no control over. Or the acts of xenophobia towards the tribal groups that until recently were the entrenched norm. But from new relations to technological innovations, and even the literal death of gods, the world is moving on from the way things were, and hopefully these changes will result in a world more tolerant than it has been in the past. That said, all these historic social taboos are spurred on by the general rarity and lack of visual discernment for mixed-race children, in and of itself creating a self-fulfilling cycle, which is due more specifically to our second major cause, which is the practical issue. Assuming optimal circumstances and ignoring taboos, the physiological reality is that a child born from parents of different races is exceedingly rare. Some even claim 1 in a million. Why this is the case isn't fully clear. As far as modern study has taken us, it seems that most spoken races share a common ancestor, from which we split in some manner over 10,000 years ago, which makes interracial procreation a logical possible outcome. But this is only our current working theory, as there is some split evidence from a few different fields of thought. As new discoveries of the past come into greater focus, perhaps our understanding may change. Okay, yes, sociology matters, but what of the practical requirements for children? Skipping over the basics of conception, as I assume most of you are at least, hopefully, aware, if a child is born to parents of 2 different races, what exactly defines their appearance? As it's not as if we see Lalafell running around with bunny ears, or Eorzean with Mikote tails. And those few specific examples we have, while varying somewhat, take strongly after one of their parents, almost exclusively. In the rare event a child is born by intention or happenstance, their physiology is primarily defined by their mother, in near all cases. There are somewhat rare exceptions of secondary characteristics being defined by the father, such as Hilda, who while sharing her mother's Hydaelyn frame has the pointed Elzen ears of her Ishgardian father. In the tales of the Auri princess and her child born to a Hydaelyn father, it said that the child had few scales, but still would have had the telltale horns and tail of the Aura. Think less of a half and half situation, and at most the mother's race with a dash of the father's characteristics. But that dash isn't even necessarily required or common. Rarity upon rarity. There are, as always, exceptions to this though, as the intermingling of different clans such as the Keeper of the Moon and Seeker of the Sun Mikote does not always result in the child having the same features as their mother. So, it's uncommon for mixed children to be born both from sociological and physiological pressures, and on top of this, most children would not even present as being different at all, making the whole ordeal harder to study or even address. One more exemption from these rules is the Garlean eye, which, regardless of which parent is Garlean, is only born to children who are pure-blood Garleans. Is what I would like to say, however, as existence is not a nice shiny box but an infinite continuum of multicolored icosahedron, there is at least one known contradiction in Severa, who while is only half Garlean, has a Garlean eye. Though A, she shares her mother's, not her father's frame, and B, her eye is the only known case of a black Garlean eye, suggesting that perhaps it's vestigial, making her a 1 in a million amongst a 1 in a million. Are black Garlean eyes only born to half Garlean women? Does the eye actually do anything? Will we ever get any answers to these questions? I'm glad you asked. We've talked of additions, but what about limitations? The limitations of certain races don't seem to cross over to children of mixed parentage. In example, the capability of ethereal manipulation is maintained by those of half Garlean descent, as we can see with Arnvald and Severa. As to if those born of half Garlean heritage can inherit other traits, like the pure-blooded tendency towards Eliozen level heights, is unknown, though hypothetically possible. All these complications aside, none of this is to say that all interracial relationships and romances are completely stymied, which is one reason such children happen at all. I want to point out that a relationship does not mandate physical intimacy, and a marriage does not mean romance, nor does it mean copulation, and none of this assumes a desire for children. Same page? Good. As I touched on a little bit earlier, while not different races, cross-clan children are quite common, as is the cultural reality of sharing names cross-clan. I'm sure many of you can speak to this from your own travels. Those like Manago Raz, with her Seeker of the Sun father and Keeper of the Moon mother, Fergus Lokilpson of Amagina and Sons, who's a Hellsguard with the Seawolf name, and Flamine, who is a Keeper of the Moon with a Seeker of the Sun's name. These practices of naming also suffer the same complications, leaving the cross-clan names the primary identifying method for their parentage. That said, as we can see with the M tribe, the mother-father rule is not always the case. But there's a wide world beyond our own 3 great continents, with groups across the sea on the New World, like the Mammal Ja, through who the union of different tribes on rare occasions can have unique consequences, resulting in the birth of blessed two-headed offspring who share the features of both clans. The rest of the New World, Mericidia, or any number of the remaining lands around us could play host to similar or even stranger cases. On the topic of romances, there's a litany of known couples or romantically interested parties of all sorts and kinds of backgrounds on Etheris. So, let's talk about Rogadin lovemaking. In this case, I'm referring to Aenor Cockburn. No, actually. And her fondness for Rogadin, much to her sister's chagrin. Infatuated to the extreme with the Boulder brothers, she actively is pining for, attempting to marry, and heavily implying a desire for having their babies. There are no ends to the implications of her amorous desires for Ochre Boulder, as well as Hoary Boulder, and Grahatia, and possibly the Warrior of Light. The point is, she actively courts many different people at the same time, and the only one who is observably distressed by this is her sister, Clemens, who went so far as to travel to Ishgard to learn astrology in order to get away from her. Less explicitly, but no less euphemistic, is the deftly skilled with a blade, Humbert Longhaft. No, actually. And his proclivity for a pair of Mikote sisters in his company, as well as tales of his far-reaching female fanbase. You know, oddly enough, between the likes of Aenor with the Boulder brothers and Longhaft with his assistants, one has to wonder if Eorzea holds the same taboos for incest. You know what? Let's move along. There are plenty less raunchy examples. From the unrequited, like Momodi of the Quicksand Inn in Ul'dah, and the Hurrian admirer who seeks her affection, which she, rather humorously, spurns, to the heartwarming messes like the warrior's Curious Gorge and Dorgono. And somewhere in between is Thancred, with his at one time rampant wooing of any and every single lady he could find. But heartache and longing isn't limited to the races we know most well, with even the desperate affections of a Rogadin male for the goblin Brayflox Altox penned into the very pages of the archived books of the Great Gooble Library. And I quote,
"By what cruel fate was I given this oversized, ungainly body and sent into this world where you abide, my princess, my goddess, my everything?"
Attesting that love truly has no limits. No example is more famous than that of Saint Shiva and her love, Hraesvelgr of the First Brood. A story etched into history, both for its importance in the records, as well as the moving of people's hearts. Its legacy even lingers onto this day, as it is a symbol of unification between dragon and man. Oh, and what about the Zayla tribal groups? If we look to people like the Dothral, they do not see the flesh of the person, but the soul, and from that deem their worth and connection. To put it another way, I doubt Sadu Khan would not bet anyone she deemed a worthy opponent. It's also more than clear that Serena of the Mole has lusty eyes for Hien, a Hyr of Doma. And speaking of the people of the steppe, what greater example could we possibly have than Magnai of the Oronir, who desperately seeks to find his Nama, regardless of race, and who gets rejected so hard some might mistake it for a number calamity. So relationships and more range from the vicarious and lustful to the platonic but deeply moving, and sometimes the impossible to define. As many of you are aware, even institutions are allowing, as no limits are placed on those who would eternally bond themselves before the 12 at their sanctum, and across Etheris are we witness to these unions. Since we're talking about unions and children, I should point out, adoption is common across the known world, and shares none of the taboos that are had for children of mixed race. Examples being Pippin Tarupin, adopted by Rabban al-Din after he was sold by his biological father to the Blood Sands for drinking money. Minfilia Ward, who lost her father during a Gubu stampede and who was adopted by Flamine Kesh. Kryl Baldesion by Galif Baldesion, and numerous other examples besides can be seen around the star. So, we know kids can be had, courtship is real, racism is bad, and hearts must feel. But what about what comes next? Every astral era and umbral era has begot a cycle of progression and regression. But, with future days looking different, and the many nations that have begun to act as melting pots, from Sharlayan, Dalmasca, Hingashi, Thavnair, Baja, Doma, and hell, basically all of Eorzea, I think it's fair to say that the 7th has room to be the end of old prohibitions. For all the races have spent the intervening 10 millennia shifting and overlapping company, those of mixed race are rare across the annals of history. But with modernity fast encroaching on Atheris, and an age of prosperity on the horizon, who knows what norms might change, and what the culture and the population of our shared home might look like in the future. Thanks for watching, Archons. This content was brought to you by the Eorzean Archives. If you enjoyed this video, help us please the 12 by leaving a like and subscribing for new content every Thursday, and comment down below with any topic you'd like to see our Archons cover in the future. For even more content, discussion, and exclusives, please check out our Discord and consider supporting us on Patreon. You know, would it be wrong to make a vor joke about Hraesvelgr and Shiva? You know, knowing Aenor, she probably wouldn't mind being crushed between two boulders, if you get what I mean. You know, I bet Fiera like rabbits.